Good evening. That film of the Battle of Amman is the first to come out of the Jordanian capital since the fighting began 7 days ago. It was flown out today by one of our two reporters in the city, Keith Hatfield, and we'll be showing you much more of it in just a moment. But first, the headlines on today's fighting. Sixth night of the fight for Amman, a battle which has left the city in a state of ruin, death and starvation. A battle which has swirled around the Intercontinental Hotel, perched on one of the 7 hills of Amman. And trapped inside were 100 journalists. If they looked out of the windows, they were shot at by both sides. Even so, ITN's 2 film crews managed to film this report by Michael Nicholson and Keith Hatfield.
The firing started at exactly 10 to 5 this morning, just as Amman was waking up to the first day of its proposed general strike. Earlier on, the guerrillas moved in their heavy armory, their B-40s and B-20 rockets, and their heavy machine guns. And a few moments ago, from the hills close to the Royal Palace, the Royal Jordanian Army began firing its artillery into the center of Amman. Firing's been continuing now for close on an hour and a half. The rocket launchers of the B-40 rockets are right into the center of Amman, firing towards the Jordanian artillery. There is no one on the streets. Cars stopped and drivers have left them where they'd stopped. You can hear the whistles.
Only dogs roam the streets at will, searching out scraps of food. The guerrillas operated mainly in small groups, carrying their rockets and ammunition with them, trying to escape the massive army firepower.
إلى الظافرين بعون الله لا مجال للخونة بيننا.
Both Al Fatah Radio, representing the biggest guerrilla group, and the military government broadcast at regular intervals. The government announced a 24-hour curfew, warning that anyone seen on the streets would be shot on sight. Also warned that if firing was seen coming from any house, the tanks would demolish it and the houses on both sides. The threat was carried out. The guerrillas' main fuel supply was hit, and so were 2 of their camps nearby. Whether this is the final showdown or not, King Hussein has never before ordered such drastic action. Much of the fighting was centered near the embassies and around the Intercontinental Hotel where we stayed. The hotel, the American Embassy and the British Embassy were shelled by guerrilla mortars. A Swedish cameraman filming from a balcony was wounded in the leg by sniper fire. He lay in the corridor for at least 3 hours. Then he was taken unconscious away by an ambulance of the Jordanian army to hospital for immediate treatment.
In particular the Egyptians, who fought their way across the Suez Canal with spectacular success, and then engaged them in the biggest and bitterest tank battles since the Second World War. It was a war in which the latest military technology overturned conventional tactics. It transformed the theories of modern warfare. High-tech Soviet missile systems challenged the now established superiority of the Israeli Air Force, hindering their attempts to carry out ground support roles in the first hours of the war. And on the ground, the apparently invincible Israeli armor came up against a new generation of anti-tank missiles. They were operated by highly trained Arab infantry who bore no resemblance to the soldiers routed in '56 and '67. The question all Israelis asked that day was why were they so ill prepared? The answer lay in the stunning Israeli victory of 1967. The key factor had been those first 3 hours of the 5th of June, in which the Israeli Air Force virtually wiped out the combined Arab air forces. The impact of total air supremacy had transformed the course of the war on the ground. Most Israeli military thinking since had been based on the belief that the Arabs would never again risk a major attack without being able to compete in the air. They believed it would be 1975 before Arab air power was strong enough to contemplate another war. However, the sheer scale of the Arab defeat put tremendous domestic pressure on the Arab leaders to try again. Syria's Golan Heights, the West Bank of Jordan, and the entire Egyptian Sinai Peninsula were a constant reminder of the humiliation of 1967. King Hussein, having lost half of Jordan to the Israelis, could not afford another direct clash. But for the new presidents now in power in both Damascus and Cairo, it was a risk they felt compelled to take. Israel still had less than half the number of men, tanks and planes, and a fraction of the missiles that Egypt and Syria could field against them. Those forces would have to cover two fronts, a further handicap for Israel. At the end of the '67 war, the Egyptians had been driven out of Sinai and had concentrated on defending the West Bank of the Suez Canal. The Israelis knew from experience that the key to the desert lay in the passes that crossed through a mountainous ridge beyond their headquarters at Bir Gifgafa. They constructed a defensive line along the east bank of the canal named after General Bar-Lev, and a series of forts were built along it. Tanks would move to prepared positions between them during an alarm. To counter Israeli air raids during the War of Attrition, the Egyptians built up one of the world's densest missile walls, creating an anti-aircraft umbrella over the whole Suez area. President Sadat realized that even without a comparable air force, he could fight a limited war under that umbrella, cross the canal, gain a foothold in Sinai, and then negotiate with Russian help. He shared his plan with Syria's President Assad, who also obtained Soviet SAM missiles to cover the Golan battlefield. They agreed a timetable for a coordinated attack when Israel would be least prepared. General Ahmed Ismail, the Egyptian war minister, was appointed to overall command of both the Syrian and Egyptian forces. He negotiated with the Russians for the military hardware they would need to ditch in the world. He calculated it would take 24 hours to bridge it and cut through the sandbanks the Israelis had built all along the canal, up to 60 feet high in places. Ample time, he thought, for the forts along the Bar-Lev line to be supported by the armor reserve, waiting further back in Sinai. The 600 men manning the Bar-Lev forts had grown complacent too. Egyptian exercises had been a regular event for months, and even fresh construction work was thought to be an attempt to stave off boredom. But like the exercises, it was just one part of the meticulous planning that would make the canal crossing an epic military achievement. In October, the Bar-Lev forts were manned by reservists of the Jerusalem Brigade, doing their annual military service. They found out what the construction work was for at 2 p.m. on the 6th. Tank ramps now overlooked their positions. The tanks joined 1,000 other guns, pouring tons of high explosive onto the Bar-Lev line, while an airstrike hit Israeli positions deep in Sinai. It was the start of a technically brilliant operation that would restore Arab military credibility. The Egyptians were so proud of it that months later, their Third Army reenacted the whole exercise for the cameras. Hundreds of machines wreathed the West Bank and the canal in smoke. Screened from Israeli eyes, 8,000 Egyptian infantry began crossing the canal in rubber dinghies at midpoints between the forts. In 1971, the Israelis had tested a method of pouring oil onto the canal from an underground system and turning it into a wall of flame. The Egyptians took no chances. The night before, frogmen had blocked pipes leading down to the canal. Once the first wave had scaled the bank and established a foothold, tank hunting units moved inland to await the first Israeli armor, equipped with RPG-7 anti-tank weapons, and the latest Soviet anti-tank missile, the Saga. Unfolded from a suitcase, it could be set up in minutes. Its wire guidance system and 3,000-yard range demanded courage and skill from the operators. Each had fired 100 rockets during training. It wrought havoc among the Israeli tanks. One unit alone claimed 8 tanks in the first 10 minutes. With a tank defense now in place and heavier equipment arriving, the second phase of the operation could begin. Designated teams began clearing the Israeli defenses, where the Jerusalem Brigade, after the initial shock, were now fighting back. Further south on the Bitter Lakes, an amphibious operation was underway. Tanks and troop carriers of the Third Army poured more men into the Sinai. In imitation of Israeli tactics, heli-borne troops had been dropped behind the lines. The 130th Marine Brigade had orders to join them in the desert. It was the only failure of the whole operation. The Israelis shot down 14 loaded helicopters, and the survivors achieved little. The Egyptian generals had estimated they would lose 10,000 men in crossing the canal alone. In fact, the barrage kept most Israelis in their bunkers. And throughout this most dangerous and exposed phase of the operation, only 208 men were lost. The problem of how to cut through the sandbanks was solved by an ingenious Egyptian lieutenant who had worked on the construction of the Aswan Dam. British irrigation pumps powered high-pressure hoses which simply washed the sand into the canal. Using this technique, they cut the holes in half the time it would have taken with either explosives or bulldozers. And during the first day, they cut 60 of them. Cutting the gaps was a feat of Egyptian ingenuity, but bridging the canal was achieved through well-tried Soviet expertise and equipment. PMP bridges designed to cross European rivers were put into use for the first time under wartime conditions. The sectional pontoons could be joined to others in minutes. On a day, the Israeli garrison said they grew across the river like outstretched arms. Another Soviet crossing system was even quicker. The GSP ferry was formed by 2 amphibious lorries which linked together in the water and would then expand hydraulically, creating a platform that could carry a tank across the canal in a matter of minutes. Every aspect of the crossing operation had been thoroughly rehearsed and planned in minute detail by General Shazli's staff, with 2 goals in mind: surprise and speed. The whole Israeli defensive system in Sinai turned on the assumption that it would take 48 hours to get armored divisions and heavy equipment across. They were convinced they could foil any attack in that time. In 10 hours, the Egyptians had already got 10 bridges set up and 500 tanks positioned on the east bank. Inside 24 hours, 2 infantry and 2 armored divisions had crossed the canal. It was the high point of the war for Egypt. Within 30 minutes of the start of the war, the Israeli armored reserve drove forward into the line according to plan, unaware of the reception that awaited them. They were decimated by the Egyptian tank hunting squads. Air power was inevitably Israel's next response, flying into the teeth of the missile umbrella to stop the crossings. rather than concentrating on the missile sites first, as they'd known they should. Plans for a preemptive strike that morning had been ruled out by American pressure. Israel would get no support if it was seen as the aggressor, as Moshe Dayan had to explain to a bemused nation. The missiles, the Air Force still had to locate the bridges hidden beneath smoke screens. Even when hit, their sectional construction made them easy to repair, and they could be floated to new crossing points with relative ease. Egyptian troops rejoiced in their achievement. They had destroyed the first counterattacks exactly according to plan, and now one by one, they were taking possession of the forts along the Bar-Lev line. Not all fell easily, though. The northernmost fort was never taken, and in the south, opposite Port Tewfik, one officer and 42 men held out for a week before surrendering through the Red Cross. After repeated attacks, they were down to their last few grenades and bullets. The Egyptian officer who took over the fort believed they'd hidden their heavy weapons. The truth was, they had none. They were ferried across to Port Tewfik, where the survivors helped their wounded comrades ashore and into captivity. Among the Israeli reserves pouring down the road into Sinai on Monday the 8th, morale was still high. Their confidence in another easy victory was reinforced by their route through the Mitla Pass, still strewn with the wreckage of Egyptian defeats in 1956 and 67. But that mood was soon replaced by a much grimmer one, as the reality of the situation and the extent of their early losses became apparent. In those first few days in Sinai, only the Egyptians had cause to celebrate. The Sinai front was 125 miles from the main Israeli cities, but in the north there was no margin for error. The Golan Heights were barely 17 miles across, and from this plateau littered with volcanic rock, 4 routes led down across the Jordan into northern Israel. The Benot Yaakov Bridge It paved the way for the Syrian armour, which then swept past the border posts. They flowed in like water, one Israeli said. I never knew there were so many tanks in all the world. The Israelis had 180 tanks and 60 guns with which to hold the 40-mile front. It was the most desperate and heroic struggle of the war. A young lieutenant with a handful of tanks held up the main Syrian thrust for 20 hours at one point, ambushing, switching position, and attacking again. Mobile artillery proved effective in slowing the advance too, and it was well employed. For the sole Israeli advantage was in knowing the ground. They'd practiced over it numerous times, measuring the ranges and the best angles of fire. But they hadn't anticipated odds of 5 to 1, or at times 11 to 1, and remorselessly they were forced back. As in Sinai, the Israeli Air Force was thrown in to slow the advance. But even at low level, running the gauntlet of the SAM batteries proved costly. They lost 40 planes in the first afternoon. Infantry-operated SAM-7s and anti-aircraft guns joined the white contails of the SAM-6s, crisscrossing the sky to deadly effect. They adapted their tactics quickly, though, flying in low over Jordan to take the Syrians in the flank, avoiding many of the batteries. Wrecked Syrian vehicles lining the route bore witness to their effectiveness. And in places, the burnt and blackened ground showed that, like the Americans in Vietnam, they were using napalm. On Sunday, Israeli reserves in modified World War II Sherman tanks were deployed in the southern sector. They were opposing T-55s and even T-62s, the Russians' latest tank. Despite the 30-year technological gap, they destroyed greater numbers of Syrians. But at a cost. The two Israeli frontline brigades were virtually wiped out. They had, however, bought time for the citizen army. Mobilization had begun on Saturday. Many didn't wait for their code words. Seizing their equipment, they headed to either front, pressing lorries, cars and buses into service. One platoon even drove a milk float to their base in Sinai. Prime Minister Golda Meir expressed their mood.
This people, small as it is, surrounded as it is by enemies, has decided to live. And if we have to pay the price for living, we have to pay it. This is not a people that can give in.
Arriving piecemeal, the first reinforcements in the Golan were sent straight to the front. The situation was so desperate, there was no time for a coordinated response. In the south, the Syrians were now only 10 minutes tank drive from the Benot Yaakov bridge. By Monday morning, though, 36 hours into the war, the roads to the Golan were jammed with troops and equipment, in civilian as well as military lorries. Approaching the heights, they had to risk artillery fire directed from Mount Hermon, which had fallen to Syrian commandos in the first hours of the war. Fully mobilized, the Israeli army began to turn the tide. Casualties had been heavy. They lost 250 men in the first 2 days in the Golan. It was not a price a small army could keep paying. And from Monday, limiting casualties became a priority. They now relied more heavily on artillery to dislodge the Syrians at long range. Yet Israel's part-time soldiers sounded confident. Syrian resistance remained stubborn in retreat, despite their staggering losses. The advancing Israelis counted 500 tanks among the wrecks strewn across the heights. North of Quneitra, the Syrian columns had been constricted by minefields, and the crack Israeli 7th Armored Division hadn't wasted that advantage. They called the area the Valley of Tears. Abandoned among the wrecks were brand new Soviet Saga carriers, capable of firing 6 of these latest missiles. Israeli mechanized infantry cleared out pockets of resistance bypassed by the advancing armor. And by Wednesday the 10th, the Israeli Chief of Staff, General Elazar, could report on Israeli progress. They crossed the ceasefire line into Syria on the 11th, taking the shortest route towards Damascus. 2 days later, they were 15 miles beyond the ceasefire line, only 25 miles from Damascus itself. The Syrian reserves put up strong opposition from prepared defenses, and the Israelis had a hard slog all the way. With his capital threatened by Israeli artillery, President Assad appealed for an Egyptian attack in Sinai to relieve the pressure. Syrian MiGs joined the desperate defense, swooping on the columns on the left flank near Mount Hermon. But it was a rare appearance, for in the air, the Israelis were once more in control. The MiGs couldn't match them in aerial combat. And having destroyed the bulk of the Syrian missile system, they were now attacking targets all over Syria, disrupting the Soviet airlift of military supplies. At C2, they were choking the supply route. In the first ever naval missile battle, they virtually wiped out the Syrian Navy. And the Soviet Union was forced to move its own fleet to keep Syrian ports open. The Americans responded by reinforcing their 6th Fleet, a thinly veiled warning against further Soviet involvement. The Arab world too came to Syria's aid. 4,000 men of the Jordanian 40th Brigade fought alongside an Iraqi armoured division, attacking the southern flank. But coordination between them proved difficult. Both suffered heavily at the hands of the Israelis. They were the last major armoured battles on the Golan front. The Israeli advance continued along the Damascus road until it ran up against the main Syrian defence line around Sassa. Now within artillery range of southern Damascus, the Israelis were content to hold their ground, switching forces to the Sinai front. In Sinai, by the 13th of October, the Egyptians had 3 bridgeheads on the eastern bank, which they'd extended sideways along most of the canal, but which were only fire according to plan. But Sadat had changed his mind. On his express orders, the 2 armoured divisions which formed the main reserve on the west bank began crossing to the east, responding to appeals for action by President Assad. The 2 fresh divisions were to lead a wide pincer movement to take Bir Gifgafa, forcing the Israelis to concentrate on their southern front. The Israelis were ready for them. It was what they'd hoped for. Tanks and infantry lay in wait, the latter now equipped with American TOW missiles. The further the Egyptians came beyond their anti-aircraft shield, the more damage they would suffer at the hands of the Israelis. At 6 a.m. on the 14th of October, the biggest tank battle since Kursk in World War II began. 2,000 tanks locked in combat along a 100-mile front. By nightfall, the Egyptians had lost a total of 264 tanks. The Israelis, only 10. Superior Israeli tactics account for part of that disparity, but another surprisingly simple reason was the suitability of the tanks to the desert terrain. When emerging from the hull-down position behind dunes, the main Israeli tank, the Centurion, could depress its barrel by 10 degrees, presenting a small target in order to fire. The lower-profile Soviet T-55 used by the Egyptians could only depress its barrel by 4 degrees and presented a much larger target in order to bring its gun to bear. It was not only... Despite that resounding defeat, President Sadat's drive to address the Egyptian People's Assembly on the 16th was akin to a Roman triumphal march. He and General Ismail were mobbed as they entered the assembly. They had given the Egyptian people a tremendous victory, restoring their national pride. In his address, President Sadat described the crossing of the canal as a miracle by any military standard, and went on to say the nation could feel safe and secure. It was now armed with a sword and a shield. But even as he spoke, a column of Israeli tanks was busy demolishing Egypt's shield. Not in Sinai, but in Africa. The Israelis had crossed the canal, and with no reserves to stop them, they were rampaging deep behind the Egyptian lines. Having identified the weak point where the Egyptian 2nd and 3rd armies met, it was the American airlift of military equipment to Israel that finally convinced Sadat of the gravity of his position. Material losses had been enormous on both sides, but he had expected the Israelis to grind to a halt long before his own Soviet supplies ran dry. Now he was forced to ask the Russians to arrange a ceasefire. Moshe Dayan had been against the crossing from the start.